Welcome to The Wild Side. This is Kight, your host on Source 96.1 FM, and that was the Be Good Tanyas singing Ship Out on the Sea. And as you might guess, given the title of that song, today we're going to be talking about the sea, and specifically we're going to be talking about marine conservation. And for those of you who are interested in writing in or texting in or calling in even, I should warn you ahead of time that this show has actually been pre-recorded the night before. And that is because I have duties during my normal slot this week because I have gotten a new job, which is very exciting. I'm helping teach up at the University of Exeter. And actually today's topic was inspired by some of the work I'm now doing in my new job, and I am working on a course that has to do with marine vertebrate conservation. And I've been doing a bunch of reading for that course about why the oceans are important and what the threats are to its biodiversity and what some of the specific organisms are that are threatened by a lot of different activities, including some of our own. And so I thought this would be a perfect thing for me to talk about this week, partly because it gives you kind of an idea of what happens up on campus and the sorts of things that we're teaching some of our students, and also partly because here we are in Cornwall and in Falmouth in particular, and we are of course quite close to the ocean and it's very important to us, and so it's something that all of us should know a little bit about because it can affect the decisions that we make and have a big impact on our lives. So first of all, just to start off with the idea of the fact that oceans are important, and why is it that oceans are important? Well, they cover the majority of our planet and also a good bit of its habitable space. So if you kind of break it down into numbers, the ocean covers more than 70% of our entire surface, but because we're talking about both horizontal space and vertical space, it covers approximately 99% of all places on Earth where organisms can live, because some of the Earth's topography is quite deep, and so the water fills that up, and that creates a whole range of habitats from quite low down all the way up to the shores that we see when many of us walk out our own houses or walk down the street during the day. So that's a whole lot of space where we can have a whole lot of organisms living. And so of course the ocean is going to be very important for the biodiversity of the planet. And in fact, there are 5 phyla of animals that live only in the ocean. So it's not only a source of biodiversity, but it's a novel source for many organisms in particular. And particularly biodiversity-rich ecosystems in the ocean include coral reefs, which pretty much everyone knows about already, also salt marshes, mangroves, seagrass beds, and estuarine environments, very much like the one that we have right outside of our doors here in Falmouth. Oceans also are important because they impact the weather, and that's because of exchange of water through the air, and so they generate these different gradients of temperature and also gradients of moisture. They change the way that biogeochemical flowing occurs. They generate atmospheric oxygen. They act as a sink for carbon dioxide, which is quite important considering that we humans are generating quite a lot of carbon dioxide. And eventually, after quite a lot of processing is done, they're also a source of drinkable water, which obviously is quite important to all organisms, including us. Now, just to kind of go into a bit more detail on some of those things I mentioned, I said that they generate atmospheric oxygen. Well, specifically, they actually they're responsible for about half of the oxygen that we breathe. And here in Cornwall, the ocean's responsible for keeping our winters as comfortable as they are. So I mentioned before that they're important for the weather. Well, because we have this flow of warm air across the Gulf Stream, bringing it up towards northern Europe, we aren't as cold as other places are that are here on the same latitude as we are in Cornwall. And of course, these are all ecosystem services, but they also provide kind of physical, obvious things right up front. And that includes food and also other useful products. So researchers have estimated that about 1/6 of the animal proteins that we eat come directly from the ocean. And also we have other things like kelp being used as an emulsifying agent, red algae, which is used. It provides something called carrageenan, and that is used in making peanut butter and things like toothpaste. Also, there are compounds from sponges and cartilage from sharks that are both used in the treatment of cancer. And these are just a few examples, but they give you an idea of how the ocean plays an important part of lots of different things that you might not necessarily have realized. On top of that, of course, we use the ocean for transportation, for ecotourism opportunities, for recreation, I'm sure I don't have to tell that to you guys because most of you probably go out on boats or go surfing or swimming on a regular basis. And also, approximately 2/3 of the world's population lives within 100 kilometers of the coastline because it is such a fruitful place to be, because it provides so many different jobs and so much food. And so we have a lot of livelihoods that are connected to the sea in some way or another, whether that's people who are fishing or people who are servicing the boats that go out in some way, or whatever it is. But there are lots of different livelihoods that are directly connected to the ocean. So what are the major threats to the ocean and also to the biodiversity that it contains? Well, probably the most important of these, because it's something that we can really control most easily, is overfishing. And this is something that we've heard a lot about, especially here in a town where you eat lots of seafood, and there's a lot of interest in knowing about how that seafood was harvested. Now, overfishing doesn't have to be just for food, but also may result as may happen because of the pet trade. And it's not just a problem of going in and taking out too many organisms, but also not managing it very well. So when you fish, you are targeting certain sizes or certain age classes, and that's how fishermen are able to tell which things they're allowed to keep and which they have to toss back in. And whenever you don't kind of manage how those techniques work and how they affect the population, then you can have a big impact on these different species. Also, another problem is that a lot of fishing efforts don't take place in national waters. They take place in international waters that don't really have any sort of police force out there, the high seas. And you can't really regulate these waters quite as easily because there are no rules that all nations have agreed to in many cases. And lots of nations do band together and say, well, we'd prefer not to do this, we'd prefer not to do that. But generally that's just a group of countries, and then you might have another country that says, well, I don't care about that at all, and so they go in and do whatever it is that they're interested in doing. And this can create a lot of tension and also have negative effects on the wildlife. Now, another problem is climate change, and this is something else that, of course, we've heard quite a lot about recently. Now, climate change leads to warmer temperatures around the world on average, and the result of this is that you have about 80 to 90% of this extra energy that's coming in being absorbed by the oceans. And so, I mean, the oceans already are having lots of the sun's rays because they take so much space up of the globe, so they've already got a lot of energy coming in. But whenever you open up the atmosphere and let even more sun in, then that means that the oceans are going to absorb even more of that energy and get a bit warmer. Now, researchers are only able to routinely measure temperatures down to a certain depth, so about 2,300 feet. After that, it gets a lot harder to send the equipment down to get regular readings. But basically, so they know that these changes are happening within 2,300 feet of the surface, and they're not exactly sure what's going on below that, because you could have these changes trickling down, and so, you know, as warm water touches cooler water, then of course that cooler water is going to get warmer, and so that might go all the way down the food chain, if you will, down to the bottom of the ocean, or it might be mitigated by other things that are happening with the flow of water and with temperatures coming up, temperatures changing because of water that's being released at the bottom of the ocean. No one's really sure what's going on down there, and so we have to kind of figure this out a bit more. But basically, the idea is that at least part of the ocean is definitely warming, and there are organisms that live in that part of the ocean, and so climate change is impacting them. And one of the big problems that's associated with this climate change is the fact that the ice is melting. And melting ice leads to changes in the water level, and also the temperature, and also the way that certain parts of the ocean are moving against other parts, so the warmer and the cooler currents and how they behave. And so all of this affects dynamics, but also it changes this what's happening along the shore, because the shore is being eroded by this extra water. And we all know that it's having impacts on polar bears, for instance, because they would use ice flows, except the ice flows aren't there. And what's really amazing is that if you look at data from the last century or so, we know that about 100 years ago, the ocean might rise something like 1 centimeter a year. And then this increased a bit by 50 years ago, and then it's increased again, so now we see that it's increasing up to 3 centimeters each year, which is quite substantial, and can have a huge impact on low-lying areas, where a few centimeters are all that stand between people's homes being all right if there is a tsunami or a flood, and people's homes being completely washed away. Now, another thing that happens as you've got climate change going on and all these greenhouse gases that we're releasing into the atmosphere, is the acidification of the waters. And this happens because the ocean is a carbon sink, so it absorbs our carbon dioxide, which is great for us, because that means that it's not in the atmosphere causing the trouble that it causes up there. But at the same time, this lowers the pH of the water. In other words, it makes it more acidic. And that's because of chemical reactions that I won't go into in too much detail. But the idea is that whenever you decrease the pH, you can have lots of impacts on the organisms that are living in the water. And recent estimates have shown that, there have been recent estimates, I shouldn't say that they've shown anything, but people have guessed that about 30% decreases in acidity have been seen over the last century. Decreases in pH, increases in acidity, sorry. So basically, the problem with this is that if you've got organisms in there that have materials that can be eroded by acidity, then this increased acidity in the water is going to make it harder for them to sustain themselves. And this is one of the things that is causing problems with coral. So if you have things that have skeletal structures, if you expose those skeletal structures to the acid, it's going to start eating away at them. And to some extent, the organisms might be able to fight back and just put more in and put more in over and over again in order to build their skeletons back up. But they might also not be able to do that. We also know that changes in pH can alter metabolism, it can depress immune systems, it can reduce the ability of some organisms to navigate because it impairs their sense of smell, and that's because smell is a chemical sense. And so when you've got different chemicals in the atmosphere, it can change the way that the molecules bind. Also, it can affect acoustic propagation and make it harder for organisms to hear. And these are actually not guesses. All of these things have been found to happen in real life. Also, the ocean has problems with invasive species, and this is a particular problem when you've got new predators that are introduced into an environment and they start eating prey that normally wouldn't have a predator. And this has been a real problem, again, at coral reefs. There have been some introduced fish that are coral reef eaters, and when they're introduced into areas where the coral have not been predated in the past, this can be quite bad because the coral has no defense against this. Also, it's quite bad if you've got organisms that kill off structural species. So when I say structural species, I mean the ones that kind of around which the environment, the habitat is built. So you have things like coral again, or algae, seagrass beds, this sort of thing, where you've got really fundamental organisms that are being eaten away by some new introduced species. And sometimes that introduced species might also not be like a predator that's eating, but it could be a disease that is killing things off. And also we know that there are predators that happen to just propagate quite a lot, and this can be problematic because they can congest the waterways, they can steal oxygen from other native species. If they bloom too much and they spread out along the surface, they can cut off supply of energy from light down to lower depths of the water. So there can be lots of problems that result from things being around that shouldn't be around. And in a way, I guess that's a sort of pollution, really, and there are many different pollutions that are affecting the oceans. And these include chemical pollution, so things like oil spills, noise pollution, which I've talked about before on this show. So noise might come in lots of different ways, but it could be things like pile driving or ships passing through. Also, even light pollution, which you wouldn't expect maybe for the ocean, but if we have things like big oil platforms that are permanent structures and they have lots of lights attached to them to make sure that boats don't run into them or low-flying planes don't hit them. Actually, those lights can cause the fish down below to react differently, and it can also affect seabirds. And so it does actually have an impact on animal behavior, and that can then affect the marine ecosystem. Another really big source of pollution is just plain old trash, so pollution. Things like those huge areas, those huge expanses of water that are covered by just plastic and garbage bags and waste that floats on the water and just sits there on top. Of course, another big problem is development, and development in particular along the coast is a real issue because it tends to get rid of habitats that are quite sensitive and necessary. And this is especially bad when you've got things that need to nest in the sand or need to, they have a very sensitive life history stage there on the coast. But also there are problems from mining and drilling platforms and also underwater pipelines, so things that are being built directly on top of the ocean or underneath the ocean, so kind of, in the water itself. And finally, one last thing that's quite important to think about is a lack of awareness. So a lot of people may not even realize that what they're doing is harmful. And I know certainly the more I do reading about these things, the more I find out about things that I've done wrong, or, not wrong, but things that I didn't realize were being harmful. And it does really make you step back and think. And one of those is, the type of seafood that you eat. And it can be very hard these days to go to the store and know what sort of seafood is all right, which of the options is sustainable. Is it bad to get something that's farmed, or should I actually get something that's farmed in order to avoid get something wild? It can be very difficult to make decisions and to know what the best choice is for the environment. So having awareness can be really helpful in helping the marine ecosystem survive. That was Deb Talon singing Rocks and Water. And today on the Wild Side we are talking about marine conservation. And I just went through a list of some of the things that are threats to the ocean. And now I'd like to talk about some of the species in the ocean that are most threatened. Now, I should say that this is actually an incomplete list, but people who study these things have recently started to go back through all of the data and to look at some of the stuff that they had was quite old, and they've wanted to update it, and so they're doing this massive effort to look at all the data that's been compiled in order to understand the biggest threats and the state of all of the different species. And they've kind of worked their way through a good portion of these, but there are some others that they still have to get to. So I'm going to talk about the ones that they've already managed to look through. So first on the list is the group of organisms, the sharks, rays, and skates that are all closely related. And these guys are all thought to be quite threatened. So about 17% of those that have been studied are threatened, and 13% more are considered near threatened. And these guys are in trouble because they're captured both on purpose and accidentally. And one of the big problems that you may have heard about in the news is something called shark fin soup. And this is an Asian delicacy. And what happens in capturing sharks for this product is that most fishermen tend to just cut off the fin and then toss the rest of the animal back in and just leave it to die. And so most of the meat is completely wasted and just falls down to the bottom of the ocean and just lies there. And so it's really quite a shame, quite a needless death in many ways. And this is particularly true given that the fins don't even have much flavor. So actually the soup itself is generally made with a chicken broth or a broth from some other sort of animal. And then the fins are just added in for texture, and also because they're thought to have health benefits. And these include increasing appetite, improving the function of your kidneys and lungs and bones. And actually, these things have been scientifically studied, and people have found very little evidence for these claims. And actually, shark meat can have very high levels of mercury, and so in fact, it may not only not be healthy, but it may be actively unhealthy. And shark fin soup tends to be served at important events or to guests of honor, and each bowl can cost upwards of $100. And so of course this makes shark fishing very attractive for fishermen, because that's quite a lot of money that they can get very quickly from just a few fins. And the real problem with this is that as we've seen these increases in the quality of life in Asia, which is great for Asian people, unfortunately it means that more people are interested in this kind of luxury item, and so it's quite bad for the sharks themselves because it's become more popular than ever. And actually, a recent survey found that about 35% of people had eaten shark fin soup in the previous year, so that's quite a large portion of the population. And one of the big problems with this is that sharks are actually a top predator, which means that if you reduce shark numbers, you can end up altering entire ecosystems because you're impacting then the number of prey species that end up being left behind, and then how they interact with their species, and so on and so on. Another important group is actually the groupers. So these are one of many different types of edible fish, but they're one of the most popular types of edible fish. They're quite large, and they have really lovely meat that it's not a delicacy, but it certainly ranks up highly with most people in terms of the best cuts of meat to have from fish. And they are identified as particularly at risk among edible fish. So 12.4% of them are threatened, and another 14% are near threatened. They're also quite popular to take not just to kill them and fillet them up to eat, but to take them to restaurants and have them in tanks so they can be eaten live from the restaurant themselves. Now, since 1950, our annual take of these fish has increased an amazing amount, 1,600%. So now it's something near 100 million a year that are fished out of the waters. And this amounts to about 275,000 metric tons of fish, which is pretty impressive. And again, because their flesh is so nice, they're quite expensive, and so they bring fishermen lots of money. So you have the same situation with the shark fins, where even though some conservationists are saying maybe we should halt the fishing of these animals, the fishermen are too attracted by how much money they can make. And one of the real problems with these guys is that they take many years to become sexually mature, and that makes them quite slow reproducers, and so they're having a hard time replenishing their own population. And these guys can be found all over the world, but they're particularly threatened in the Caribbean, in Brazil, and in Southeast Asia. And because they're important reef fish, then their disappearance from reef habitats can unbalance the system, just like getting rid of the sharks can impact the species that are later on in the food chain. Now, I keep mentioning corals, and of course corals, in particular reef-building corals, are very threatened. They're one of the most recognizably threatened species in the marine environment. So approximately almost a third of corals are threatened, and another 20% are near threatened. So that means that we've got almost half of all coral, reef-building coral species in trouble. And this is a real problem for these guys. I mean, they're threatened because they are threatened by lots of different things all at the same time. Some of these I've already mentioned, some of them are a bit new. So bottom trawling by fishing vessels is particularly bad, as is other types of mechanical disruption from fishing gear. So these structures are quite delicate, and you cannot really put pressure on them or grate across them. You know, they're adapted to deal with fish munching on them to some extent, but they're not adapted to the wide-scale kind of effects of fishing vessels, and even scuba divers that might go stand on them. Also, there's direct harvesting of corals. There's destruction during seafloor excavations that are associated with mining and pipelines. As I already mentioned, we've got issues from changes in the ocean temperature and ocean acidification, because they're quite sensitive species, and so even tiny little adjustments to these parameters can impact how well they can build their skeletons and how well they can get food out of the environment and conduct their kind of regular metabolism and life history. They're polluted from a number of sources, including agriculture, coastal development, and oil and chemical spills. But then you've also got quote-unquote natural sources of death. So things like disease and predation are a real problem, and these are changing now because of introduced species and other kind of different anthropogenically caused differences in the marine environment. And there's something called the coral triangle, which is the area in between Indonesia and Malaysia and the Philippines. And this is a really lush habitat for corals, and it's particularly threatened. And this is a problem not only for the corals themselves, but because this whole area is kind of an epicenter of marine diversity. And so if you get rid of the corals that are in this area, they're going to take a lot of the other species with them, because they are kind of the keystone of those habitats. Now, marine mammals are one of the most visible of species, because these guys often come out into land, and so we do see them more than we see things that are in the water the whole time. And also because they're quite charismatic. So this includes things like whales and dolphins, of course, that people really love, and you hear a lot about them in the news when they surface. So what's really odd about this, though, is the fact that even though these guys are often better known to us, they're actually extremely poorly studied. And that's because they tend to be quite hard to get to. They range really widely, and so when they migrate, you kind of lose touch with where they are and which individuals are doing what. And this is particularly true for things like whales and dolphins and porpoises. And some of these guys actually are only known from brief encounters during stranding events, and so there are even species out there that we're not very familiar with. The threats to these guys include things like being tangled in fishing gear. Some of them are harvested directly, so seals are a good example of that. Loss of coastal habitat that they use for resting and breeding and aggregating and doing other important kind of social things. And that's another thing that's kind of unique in this group is the fact that they can get hit by boats. So this is especially true for things like whales and dolphins and dugongs. And also these guys are particularly affected by noise pollution, because they are they have very sensitive communication, so they're very good at hearing, and vocalizations play a very important role in their life history. So they coordinate migrating together, they coordinate mother-calf relationships, female-male relationships when they're breeding. And so when you've got noise pollution, it can confuse them so they can't navigate or they can't find each other. And it can cause physical damage as well, not just in these guys, but in other species too. When you've got noise pollution that's particularly strong, it can actually damage the inner ear and cause hearing loss. Now, noise pollution, of course, is particularly going to be problematic for whales, and so people are actually studying this quite well. And there's been an interesting study, actually, where they looked at whale poo in order to look at the stress levels in the samples that floated to the surface, and they found that whales that were in noisier habitats did have higher levels of stress hormones in their fecal samples. And so this does suggest that there is a real problem for whales that are near humans and human traffic. And other sources of pollution, as I kind of mentioned earlier, it's not just pile driving and boat propellers, but also things like sonar. And the military gets a lot of flack for this because they go out and they do these surveys with their sonar, and it can be quite damaging and confuse animals that are navigating by sound. And they actually think that one of the reasons that we see strandings is potentially because there are animals that get quite perplexed after they're bombarded with these sonar events, and then it can cause them to go off course. Now, I mentioned earlier the polar bear. That's another mammal species that's particularly well known for being in bad shape. And it's only listed as being vulnerable, but it is quite famous because it's been listed, because it's been used, as an exemplar. And these guys have lost their prey items because they're being taken by human fishermen. They're losing their habitat because of development and ice melt. And so we see these horrible pictures of these poor animals trying to run across the ice and having the ice break underneath them because it's just not as thick as it used to be. And what's quite sad about mammals as well is that they're one of the few groups where definite extinctions have been documented within recent history. And actually just within the last 50 years, there have been two species that have been known to go extinct because of hunting, and that's the Japanese sea lion and the Caribbean monk seal.